Reports are emerging that a rift is widening amid growing tension between Prince Harry and King Charles.
The briefing room had already been prepared. Chairs were aligned. Sealed folders waited beneath the royal crest, and senior advisors believed the morning would proceed exactly as planned. Then King Charles reached the final page of the attendance list and saw one name that changed everything: Harry. The monarch's hand stopped, his expression hardened. Without offering an explanation, Charles closed the folder, pushed back his chair, and cancelled the entire Privy briefing. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not move. She watched him set the folder down with a force that silenced every whisper, and she understood this was not a clerical mistake. The Privy briefing, a confidential meeting where the sovereign receives sensitive advice on matters of state, had been called to examine royal security, overseas representation, family access, and the monarchy's public strategy. Canceling it meant freezing decisions that could affect the crown for months. Yet Charles cared about none of that in those stunned seconds. He cared only about the name before him. The king picked up a black pen and circled Harry's entry once. Then he looked toward the advisors around the table. "Who authorized this?" he asked. No one answered. The silence cut deeper, because the list appeared to have passed through his own office. To Charles, that made the inclusion feel deliberate, almost personal, as though someone had used royal procedure to force open a family wound he had tried to seal. Camilla saw his anger sharpen, but she also saw the pain beneath it. Harry was not merely an absent prince or a controversial name attached to palace disputes. He was the monarch's son, and the sight of that name dragged every failed conversation back into the room. She asked whether the entry could have survived from an earlier draft. Charles did not answer her. Instead, he turned the page and discovered a handwritten mark beside Harry's name, a notation indicating that his presence had been approved through a private arrangement made before the briefing was announced. The closed door changed everything. Charles ordered the councillors dismissed and demanded that the original attendance record be brought directly to him. As officials gathered their papers, one advisor slipped outside and sent a message to Prince William. The future king read it twice. The briefing had been cancelled because of his brother, and their father wanted the untouched list placed in his hands. But before Charles could discover who had placed Harry's name before him, William had to confront what that name still meant inside their fractured family. To the officials waiting outside, Harry's name was a security problem, a procedural breach, and a question of royal protocol. To King Charles, it was something far more dangerous. It was the name of a son he still loved, a son he no longer trusted, and a reminder of every private conversation that had ended in disappointment. For William, however, the cancelled briefing carried a different warning. Old family divisions were now threatening the crown itself. Charles remained alone after the room had emptied, turning Harry's name card slowly between his fingers. For one brief moment, the anger left his face. Then the king placed it face down, as though hiding the name could silence everything it carried. Royal protocol, the formal rules controlling how members of the monarchy enter official meetings and exercise authority, gave him every reason to keep his son away. Yet fatherhood gave him reasons that were harder to dismiss. If Harry returned through an official door, the crown could appear weak. If he was rejected without explanation, the family might lose its last chance to speak honestly. William entered without ceremony and closed the door behind him. The prince had spent years preparing to protect the institution he would one day inherit. But protecting it now meant standing against his own brother. He told Charles that Harry's sudden inclusion felt calculated, not compassionate. Someone had tried to force reconciliation through palace machinery instead of allowing the family to face its wounds directly. The monarch listened without interrupting, but William saw the tension in his hand and understood that every argument about duty was also an argument about a son. Camilla stepped forward only after the silence became unbearable. She reminded Charles of a private written request Harry had sent months earlier through a trusted secretary. In that documented appeal, the Duke had asked for a direct audience with his father, and had specifically requested that William not attend. The Queen Consort remembered the monarch reading it twice, before locking it away without a formal reply. Now she wondered whether someone had treated his silence as unfinished permission rather than refusal. William opened the original attendance record and pointed to the heading above Harry's name. It did not say external attendance, the category used for invited figures outside the working royal circle. It said family consultation, a label suggesting that someone still viewed the Duke as part of the monarchy's private decision-making structure. The future king admitted that this detail disturbed him more than the invitation itself. It meant Harry's name had not simply been added. It had been placed with intention. Charles finally looked at his eldest son and asked whether he believed Harry had arranged it. William hesitated. He did not think his brother had the access, but he suspected someone close to the sovereign had acted on an older promise. That suspicion led them back to a private gathering months earlier, the moment when one forbidden promise had quietly set the entire crisis in motion. The cancellation did not begin with a name on a list. It began months earlier, after a private memorial service when the royal family had gathered without cameras, speeches, or crowds. Grief had softened voices that usually remained guarded. In that fragile atmosphere, Harry approached his father beside a closed chapel door and asked for one final chance to be heard. Charles gave no public answer, but someone nearby heard the king make a promise that would later become impossible to contain. Harry had waited until the others began to leave St. George's Chapel before moving toward Charles. The chapel, a royal place of worship used for family services, weddings, and burials, had offered them something the palace rarely did: silence without officials controlling every word. Camilla remained several steps away, while William paused near the corridor after sensing that his brother was about to speak. For once, titles offered no protection. They were simply a father and two sons, standing beneath years of anger. The Duke told Charles he was not asking to return as a working royal. He did not want duties, public authority, or a ceremonial place beside the crown. He wanted one thing: not to be erased as a son whenever the palace discussed his children, his security, or the future of the family. The king listened with visible strain. He knew those subjects mattered because decisions involving Harry's children could shape their connection to Britain, while security questions could determine whether private visits were possible at all. William heard enough to understand where the conversation was heading. The prince felt blindsided as his father's voice softened, because compassion had often become the doorway through which unclear promises entered palace policy. He stepped closer, but Camilla quietly asked him to wait. She feared that interrupting would turn grief into another confrontation. He obeyed, though his silence carried its own warning. Charles finally placed one hand against the closed vestry door. A vestry is a private room beside a chapel, where clergy prepare and confidential conversations can occur away from a congregation. Looking directly at Harry, the monarch said, "When the family's future is formally discussed, your voice will not be excluded." The sentence was not announced, written, or debated. Yet a senior private secretary standing nearby heard every word. The secretary later recorded the exchange in a documented internal account and treated it as a direct royal instruction. Months later, that note became the basis for placing Harry under family consultation on the Privy briefing list, even though Charles had never approved a formal invitation. When the king learned the truth, his anger changed direction. No hidden enemy had challenged him. His own promise had created the crisis because he had offered comfort without defining its limits. And when Harry finally appeared before him without advisors or ceremony, Charles could no longer hide behind the cancelled meeting. Harry did not enter the room as a prince demanding privilege. He entered as a son, carrying the weight of a promise. Charles stood behind the desk, the cancelled attendance list between them, while William remained near the door with his jaw tightened. No aides were permitted inside. No statement had been prepared. Then Harry placed one hand on the marked page, looked directly at his father, and said the sentence Charles had feared. "You gave me your word." Charles held his ground, but the accusation struck harder than anger. The king had summoned Harry after the palace confirmed that the disputed entry came from his own memorial promise, not from an outside demand. The cancelled Privy briefing, A confidential meeting where the sovereign receives sensitive advice on state matters had included questions about royal security, future duties, and the structure of the monarchy. That made every name on the list dangerous. Affection could not be allowed to blur access. William stepped away from the door and said the meeting had never been designed for family repair. The prince explained that it contained succession contingencies, private plans for how authority would pass during illness, absence, or emergency. Harry's presence, even briefly, could have been misunderstood as a return to official influence. The future king refused to let one emotional promise reshape constitutional boundaries without scrutiny, and he made that clear with a firmness that sounded almost like accusation. Harry turned on Charles instead. He said the cancellation had humiliated him before he was allowed to explain why his name appeared. He accused his father of offering warmth in private and retreating whenever that warmth became inconvenient in public. The Duke's voice remained controlled, but the pain beneath it was unmistakable. "You separate the father from the sovereign only when I need the father," he said. The monarch tried to answer that a personal promise could not automatically become a royal command, yet his voice faltered before the sentence was finished. The silence broke when Harry revealed how the request had actually been made. In a documented letter sent through the private secretary, he had asked for a separate family discussion after the official session, not permission to attend the full briefing. His name had been placed in the wrong category. William immediately looked toward the attendance memorandum, and Charles followed his gaze. Charles lifted the original document and saw a review mark beside the classifications. William's office had examined the list 3 days earlier. The king asked what his eldest son had known and why he had said nothing before the folders reached the table. For the first time, the prince hesitated. Harry watched him carefully, sensing that the crisis had shifted away from the promise and toward a decision made inside the future king's own circle. The confrontation had exposed Harry's pain, but the next discovery threatened William's authority and revealed how palace power had shaped the crisis before Charles ever saw the list. The attendance list had passed through several offices, but only one amendment carried the authority to determine where Harry's name appeared. Charles studied the paper, while William stood motionless across from him. There was no forged signature, no outsider's interference, and no mysterious palace enemy. The change had been made inside the future king's administrative chain. Yet the truth was more complicated than betrayal, because William had not added Harry's name, he had tried to contain it. William finally explained what his office had received. The private secretary's written instruction described Harry as a family participant, but no formal category existed for a non-working royal promised limited consultation. That distinction mattered, because a working royal performs official duties on behalf of the monarch, while Harry no longer held that active role. The prince had therefore ordered his staff to keep his brother outside the principal constitutional discussion and place him only in a separate family session after the briefing ended. Charles lowered the paper but did not soften. The king asked why the corrected page had never reached him before the folders were bound and distributed. William answered that the revision had been approved, yet an older version remained inside the final pack. He insisted that he had not tried to invite Harry into state business. He had tried to protect both the monarchy and his father from a promise made during grief. That defense only deepened the wound. The monarch heard concern, but he also heard his eldest son admitting that he had managed a private family matter without trusting him with the truth. William's restraint finally broke. He said he feared Charles would let guilt overrule judgment if Harry appealed to him directly. The prince believed one emotional decision could create the appearance that royal access was being restored through family pressure rather than formal authority. His words were calm, but their meaning was brutal. The king removed his glasses and remained silent, visibly wounded by the suggestion that his love for one son had made him unreliable in the eyes of the other. Camilla entered, carrying an archived note from a documented palace record. The queen consort placed it before Charles and explained that he had repeated his intention to hear Harry several weeks after the memorial. The note proved the chapel promise had not been a passing emotional mistake. Yet one line changed everything. Any meeting with the Duke must occur outside constitutional proceedings. Both the monarch's compassion and William's caution had therefore been valid. The disaster had come from silence between them. Charles made the decision without raising his voice. The Privy briefing would be rescheduled without Harry, while a separate meeting between the King, William, and the Duke would take place that evening. Protocol had failed to settle the family's pain. Now the three men would have to face it directly. By separating the crown's business from the family's unfinished pain, Charles regained control. But the decision immediately sent consequences through every royal corridor. By afternoon, the decision had hardened into palace procedure. New invitations were issued. Security instructions were rewritten. Harry's name disappeared from the Privy briefing as though it had never been there. Yet inside the residence, nothing felt corrected. Charles remained troubled, William remained defensive, and Harry stood alone beside a window after receiving the amended schedule. The removal was expected. What broke him was the formal sentence beneath it: no future constitutional attendance without the sovereign's written approval. Harry read the restriction twice before lowering the page. The new rule separated family consultations from constitutional business, meaning personal conversations could continue, but official meetings involving state authority would remain closed to him. That distinction mattered because the Privy Council, a formal body that advises the sovereign on government and constitutional matters, handled discussions that could affect succession, security, and the future structure of the crown. The Duke had expected exclusion from those matters. He had not expected the distance to be written so coldly. Charles watched from the adjoining room and felt the contradiction tear through him. The king had restored order by removing ambiguity, yet the same decision had turned his son's absence into permanent procedure. Harry would receive no classified papers, meet none of the councillors, and enter no future constitutional session without direct written approval. The monarch knew why those limits were necessary. He also knew his own signature had transformed family mistrust into an official barrier. William remained near the doorway, convinced the boundary had come too late. The prince believed the monarchy could not survive if private promises kept slipping into formal authority. Still, he saw Harry's face change as the amended schedule was folded, and the certainty in his own expression weakened. Protecting the crown had brought clarity, but clarity had also exposed the cost. Camilla entered quietly and told Charles about the sealed letter Harry had carried into the palace. In a documented note delivered through his private secretary, the Duke had written the terms under which he would accept permanent separation from official royal affairs. The Queen Consort warned that it was not a demand for power. It might be his final attempt to end the cycle of invitation, rejection, and public humiliation that had defined every return. Harry crossed the room and placed the envelope on the table without opening it. He said it was intended for his father, but he was not ready for Charles to read it yet. First, he wanted to speak with William alone. The future king looked toward the sealed letter, then back at his brother. Neither man moved for several seconds. Both understood that the next conversation would decide whether the document became a final surrender or the beginning of a different kind of peace. With the officials gone and their father waiting beyond the closed door, the two brothers finally faced each other without titles, advisors, or excuses. For years, every conversation between William and Harry had carried an invisible audience: the palace, the press, their advisors, and the memory of everything already said. This time, there was no one else in the room. William closed the door himself. Harry remained standing, his sealed letter still outside with Charles. Neither brother offered an embrace. Neither pretended the damage could vanish. But for the first time, they spoke not about winning, returning, or punishment, only about ending the war. William remained near the door, as though distance might help him control what came next. No aides, spouses, or palace officials stood between them. The Privy briefing had already been settled. Harry would not attend, and any future family contact would be kept separate from affairs of state. That separation mattered, because constitutional business involved the formal powers, duties, and succession plans of the monarchy, while private contact carried no official authority. The boundary was clear, the pain was not. Harry spoke first. The Duke said losing access to royal duty was not what wounded him most. He had already accepted that life. What hurt was the belief that every call, letter, or request was treated as a threat before he was allowed to explain it. William listened without interrupting, though his expression tightened when his brother said, suspicion had replaced trust, so completely that even silence now looked dangerous. The prince finally admitted what caution had done to him. He had begun treating fear as certainty, assuming every private exchange might later return as public conflict. Yet he also told Harry that trust could not survive while family moments remained exposed to arguments beyond the room. The future king did not accuse him of planning betrayal. He simply said the monarchy could not keep paying for misunderstandings. Neither brother had the courage to prevent. Harry then revealed the meaning of the sealed letter through a recorded private conversation between them. It contained no demand for a royal role, no request for classified access, and no attempt to enter constitutional discussions. Instead, it formally accepted that he would hold no official voice while asking for a defined private channel to Charles, one that would not depend on secretaries, invitations, or emotional promises made without limits. William lowered his guard, but only slightly. He agreed to support the arrangement on one condition: neither side could ever turn family contact into implied royal authority again. Harry accepted without argument. The agreement did not repair their brotherhood, but it ended the struggle over what each conversation meant. The two men returned to Charles together. The king looked from one son to the other, and understood that they had not reconciled. They had done something harder. They had built a narrow path through the damage, and placed the final choice before him. Their agreement would remain private, but outside the palace gates, the cancelled briefing had already become a national drama, demanding an explanation. Before the palace could release its carefully measured statement, the story had escaped. By evening, the cancellation was no longer confined to royal offices or private family grief. It belonged to broadcasters, newspaper editors, crowds, and commentators who saw Harry's name as proof of either royal cruelty or dangerous palace confusion. Yet one image captured the public mood more powerfully than any debate. A newspaper held against the railings of Buckingham Palace beneath the words, "One name stopped the king." Charles watched the coverage in silence. The king had hoped the palace statement would calm speculation, but every sentence seemed to deepen it. Officials confirmed that the briefing had been postponed because private family consultation had been confused with constitutional business. Constitutional business means official decisions linked to the powers, duties, security, and succession of the monarchy. The distinction mattered because Harry could still speak to his father as family, but he could not enter discussions carrying state authority. Harry heard the argument from another room. One broadcaster described him as the absent prince whose name can still empty a royal room, and the Duke switched off the television without replying. He had accepted exclusion from the briefing, yet the public language made that private settlement sound like a humiliation. To some viewers, Charles had defended the crown. To others, the monarch had proved that the family remained emotionally trapped by one son's absence. Rain sharpened the moment outside Buckingham Palace. A small crowd gathered near the gates, as a newspaper vendor raised the front page above his head. One name stopped the king. Some people defended the decision. Others called it cruel. Then an elderly woman stepped forward and placed a handwritten card against the railings. It carried only 6 words: "Be a father, but remain the king." The message spread across broadcasts because it captured the conflict more clearly than any official explanation. William watched the same image and understood why the crisis had escaped palace control. The prince had wanted clear boundaries, but the public now saw those boundaries as a judgment on Harry's place in the family. He told Charles that silence would allow every side to invent its own version of the truth. The monarch listened, though he knew any fuller explanation would expose private promises that had never belonged to the nation. The palace finally announced that the rescheduled Privy briefing had concluded successfully. A new written protocol, a formal set of rules guiding future decisions, now separated family dialogue from state consultation. Harry would hold no official authority, yet private communication with Charles would remain possible. The question had changed. It was no longer whether the Duke would return to royal power, It was whether the king could remain his father without weakening the line he had just drawn. The answer came not through another announcement, but through the document Charles signed after the palace had fallen quiet. Long after the rescheduled briefing had ended, Charles returned to the same desk where Harry's name had first stopped him. The original list remained inside a closed folder. Beside it rested Harry's sealed letter and the agreement reached by the two brothers. The king read every page slowly. Then he took up his pen, not to restore Harry to royal authority, and not to cut him from the family, but to draw the boundary that none of them had managed to define. Charles signed the state restriction first. The agreement confirmed that Harry would hold no place in privy briefings, constitutional planning sessions, classified royal discussions, or official decisions involving the working monarchy. Constitutional planning meant preparing how royal authority, duties, and succession would operate during future change or crisis. That boundary protected the crown from confusion. It also placed the Duke outside the formal structure he had once served. The king paused before signing the second page. This part created a direct private channel through which Harry could speak to his father about family matters, without secretaries turning those conversations into implied promises. No personal discussion would create official rights, access, or expectations. Charles understood what the two signatures represented. One belonged to the sovereign defending the institution. The other belonged to a father refusing to abandon his son completely. Harry accepted the settlement without protest. The Duke felt the weight of everything he had lost, yet he also felt relief. He would no longer wait for unclear invitations or depend on palace intermediaries who might misunderstand private words. His relationship with Charles would remain limited, but it would finally be honest. The king saw that sadness in him and understood that clarity could still hurt, even when it was necessary. William stepped forward and countersigned the procedural agreement. The prince's signature confirmed that protecting the crown did not require denying Harry's place in the family's private emotional history. He had not restored trust, and he had not erased the past, but he had accepted that boundaries could exist without cruelty. Charles then opened the original folder and removed the disputed attendance page. Rather than archiving it as evidence against anyone, the monarch tore it apart. The crisis had not been created by conspiracy. It had grown from grief, miscommunication, and promises made without limits. The cancelled briefing did not bring Harry back, and it did not erase him. It forced Charles to choose clarity over guilt, William to choose restraint without punishment, and the Duke to accept family connection without royal power. The monarchy emerged more disciplined. The family became quieter, smaller, and finally honest about what could, and could not, be repaired. In the end, Harry's name did not destroy the briefing. It compelled the king to separate love from authority, closing one painful chapter so the crown and the family could move forward without another false promise. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.